Tonight, we're extremely fortunate to welcome a games industry veteran who has worked on some of the biggest titles of the last 20 years. Our speaker secured her first industry role as a coder at Sony Online Entertainment. In 2004, she joined Ubisoft, becoming producer on Assassin's Creed. At the time, she told Eurogamer something which I think kind of sums up her career so far. Whenever you see a big success, it's because someone took a big risk. I'm pushing our creative teams to think about meaning and to say something deeper. Please, will you give a warm welcome to Jade Raymond.
I'm so thrilled to be here. To have been invited by BAFTA is a great honor. From what I understand, I'm the first woman to give the annual lecture series, so that's also quite an honor. What I want to talk to you about is managing creativity, what the games industry can learn from the games industry.
Everyone always asks a little kid what you want to do, and so you feel like you need to have an answer. And I was thinking about it quite a bit and trying to find something that would mix art and science. And the only job that people came up with is architect. But every time I spoke to architects, they said, no, don't become an architect, which I still find quite strange. And it was one day, actually, I was visiting my uncle and I was trying to beat him at all of his games. And it dawned on me that someone gets to make video games, and that was a great mix of art and science. So that's when I decided I was gonna make video games for a living.
As game developers, we really are experts at engaging the players. We know how to pique a player's interest and keep them coming back for more as long as possible. We know how to tune the difficulty level just perfectly to keep challenge at the right spot. We know how to get players to collaborate by designing systems that encourage them to do so. We know how to balance classes so that people form collaborative teams with complementary skill sets. And we even know how to build communities that are passionate about our games. And the thing that I wonder is why we don't apply all of these tools that we use to engage players to better engage our own creative talent.
The game design and production process varies tremendously from company to company. So you might get a first job. For example, I first worked at Sony and think it works a certain way, but then I went to EA and it works a different way. And then, I was at a startup and they had their own way of doing things. And then at Ubisoft, there was an opportunity to also propose new ways. So yeah, there isn't one set best practice that's used across the industry.
If you look at the most recent IGDA game developer survey, you see some shocking facts that have surfaced. One of them is that in the last 5 years, the average game developer has switched companies 4 times. And then on top of this movement from company to the next, we're also losing some of our best talent. People are leaving for a better quality of life, a better work-life balance. They're leaving because they're burnt out, or they're just leaving because you can actually get better pay and hours in other industries. I think this is appalling, don't you? This is an issue that we've had in the game industry for quite a while. And every year, when it comes to be around evaluation time, I always get the question of, why am I still at this level, or what can I do to progress in my career? For game companies, it's vital to keep this talent because it directly relates to the quality of the games we're able to make. If you were designing an MMO where your goal was to have people stay in the MMO and play it for a lifetime, would you ever make an MMO with 5 or 6 levels? I don't think so. So that's when I kind of realized that all of these things, that there are many parallels with things that we know as game developers and game creators that we just don't apply to motivating our own teams.
The thing I love most about game development is all the talented people you get to work with. Fantastic artists and traditional illustrators who've gone to fine art school. You get to work with musicians who are sound designers and composers and, programmers, which is something everyone knows about the game industry, but there are also so many different types of creative people. It's really when teams have chemistry and come together and gel and you're all building on each other's ideas that the magic really happens.
It's interesting because every time I come to make a talk like this, people want to know how they get their idea made into a game. And I guess I don't want to sort of disappoint people, but the reality is that we're not lacking great ideas in the video game industry. What we're lacking is great, talented teams that can have a shared vision and bring those ideas to life. Because the tough bit is all the hard work between the idea and the actual product. In line with this, there's this quote from Stephen King: "Talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates the talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work." I mean, a great idea is important, and it can really launch a success. You know, you need the motivation behind that, because even a team that is talented and experienced and has a great idea, if they don't feel supported in their roles, if they don't feel challenged anymore because they're doing something that they have already done, all of those things can mean that the best, most talented people can become disengaged and complacent. And I really do believe that you can't have an inspired game without an inspired team.
You're trying to find something which is fun, and especially if you're innovating and trying to create a new definition of fun or new types of gameplay, you don't necessarily know what's going to work or not. I kind of, sometimes I make the analogy to people of like stand-up comedy. Comedians have to try it out, and sometimes they don't work, and iterate on their routine. And the same thing happens with game development, is you might have so many great ideas, of creative ideas, of things you think are going to be fun, of stuff that's never been tried before, and then when you actually get it implemented, maybe it doesn't end up being so much fun, or maybe it doesn't work because no one understands what it was you were trying to do. So all of a sudden you're kind of, you know, oh, okay, well, we still have to ship this thing, so what are we going to do? And it's that scrambling against, you know, playing with the unknown and searching for the thing that is going to work comes with risks.
Assuming that you have a game that has activities that players enjoy and that's fun to play, a lot of what dictates how long a player will stay in a game has to do with the reward system and how it's set up. The truth is that people are very good at optimizing the best path to success and rewards, so we do have to pay attention to how they are divided up in the real world and in games. So for example, the most fun thing to do in Destiny is probably not to sit around and camp a loot cave. But because this is the easiest way to advance and get, you know, get your XP and your points and everything, that's what people do. In Assassin's Creed, we decided to put feathers around all around the world and give an achievement for collecting the feathers. And our logic was that artists had spent many hours recreating these historical cities, and we wanted people to see them. If you ask me, collecting feathers is actually quite boring. But you know, we put a reward associated with it, and people did do it. The same is true in the workplace. Monetary rewards and bonuses and things like that have fallen out of favor, and people say what people really care about is recognition these days. That's the most important reward. If someone is miserable in their job and you throw a little bit more money at them, they're not going to stay in their miserable job. If you think of bonuses, it really is a combination of a monetary reward with recognition, as long as they're merit-based bonuses.
There are a lot of different things that are important to keep good motivation within a team. And I think you also have to just make sure you're putting the right people together. I mean, people do have to fundamentally be self-motivated and understand, you know, have a passion for games.
So here's another instance where I was having some discussions with executives who were wondering, why is it that all of these game teams are working in a silo, not sharing their technology, not exchanging their, you know, lending their code or their best practices? It turns out that the bonuses were 100% based on the success of your game team. So ultimately, the reward system and the merit-based bonuses were not in line.
I think the most important thing to have in a team is the transparency and the feeling that everyone can be candid with each other. Everyone has their perspective and their expertise, and it's all of that coming together that's going to make the great game.
If you look at video games, there are a lot of good examples of how we have lined up rewards with the objectives. So, for example, in games like Dota 2, there are incentives for veteran players to recruit new players by giving XP bonuses and things like that for playing with newbies. In Quake Wars, for example, there are also XP bonuses that you get for doing things that help the team, which encourage teamwork. So I think it would be logical that if you want more collaboration across teams, some portion of the bonus should be tied to the success of the company. You know, if you truly want people to be taking risks, they won't necessarily make those decisions or optimize for that if their bonus is tied to purely the profitability of their game.
I think there are quite a few things that you can do in terms of how you structure production to allow for or to enable more surprising ideas to bubble up or give people more creative freedom, and a lot of them do help the quality of your game in the end, because sometimes you don't know where the best idea is going to come from. having a phase during pre-production where more of the team can contribute to figuring out what those breakthrough ideas are, prototyping their own ideas and pitching those, I think is great.
I really want to point out that I'm not advocating gamification of the workplace. I do think that would be a terrible idea. You don't necessarily want to use an understanding of behavioral psychology to get certain behavior out of people that you work with. But these systems, whether we like them or not, do exist at work, and we have an opportunity to just make sure that the ones that we have in place reflect what we actually want.
A really great game is when you feel like you can get into that zone and you just sort of, you don't even feel the time passing, you just feel like you're in this perfect rhythm of things.
People are spending 60 hours or more in our games these days. It's really a large portion of their time in any one game. And I think it's really a shame if we squander our opportunity to impact people with a more meaningful message. I worked on The Sims, and I don't think it was necessarily Will Wright's intention to make a statement about capitalism, but I got this graph. It was done by one of the game designers, and he made it to illustrate the core gameplay loop of The Sims. And I think it does make an interesting statement about the materialistic rat race that we're caught in. What's interesting about that is there's no narrative. It's ingrained in the game system. Similarly, there was a fantastic interview with Miyamoto. He talks a bit about his intentions when he created Pikmin and how he designed death in the game to kind of show that there's always more life afterwards that follows. I believe that when you have meaning in your game, the player will take away more. You can actually enrich people's lives, not just entertain them. And similarly, in a company, when you have a purpose and you stand for something, you actually will have people feeling more fulfilled and more engaged. I think it's important to note that in video games, we have the ability to lead people to an epiphany and come to conclusions in a way that other mediums don't. Because on top of the narrative, we also have the game systems that can reinforce meaning and value, whether it's the death system like this, whether it's the core gameplay loop, and we can really make a statement.
People are looking for a different experience in games, and people are looking for a different experience in all kinds of media and in products and the way that they interact in general. I feel like if you're going to label the era that we're in, it's sort of the age of self-expression where people really want to do their own thing and share that with a broader audience, and that trend is reflected in many different industries, including game development.
So another aspect of game design that I want to talk about is tutorials and also their workplace counterpart. Now, on Assassin's Creed, we actually made a terrible tutorial. We made a very long tutorial with all of the things you needed to know jam-packed. We taught the things out of context. Since we put it in the Animus room, we postponed the promise of actually getting to feel like a badass assassin till quite a bit later. But there are quite a few games that have done tutorials well. A recent example that was good, I thought the beginning of the game in Last of Us was great. You didn't even really feel as though there was a tutorial, it just hooked you right away emotionally. One of my favorite examples, though, is the approach that they took in City of Heroes to the sidekick mechanic. They incentivized people to recruit their buddies and teach them how to, play the game. At Ubisoft Toronto, actually, in the first year, we recruited 120 people. And we were only 20. What we put in place was a very simple buddy system. And we gave the buddy a budget to take the new person out to lunch and also coffee a few times. Eventually, this forms relationships. And the main reason I think people end up having fun at work and staying long term has a lot to do with the people they get to work with.
People sometimes feel a lot of pressure at work, and the fun of getting to work on something as amazing as video games is forgotten. And I think we have to, keep perspective on things. And so I think also sometimes games take themselves a little bit too seriously. So I think it's just sort of, enjoying the industry that we're in.
My next point is that the best rules are the simplest rules, or even better, if you don't have to create rules, create systems. That's what's going to allow players to have more agency and have their own experience. It's not such a new thing. I think if you look at the bomb jumps in Metroid, or in Deus Ex, when people discovered that you could climb walls on the mines, to really more recently, the incredibly unexpected ways that people are playing Minecraft. The most fun that people are having in your games these days is not necessarily the fun that the game designer had in mind. The real-world parallel in the workplace is that the best ideas can come from anywhere. An early example is when Deming had a big influence on the assembly line in Japan, basically what he implemented was a cord at each station and that anyone could pull to stop the assembly line. All the other assembly lines, it was like, at all costs, just keep it running, keep it running. But his approach was anyone can stop the assembly line, despite the cost associated with that, can say what's gone wrong and come up with an answer, a solution. This approach transformed things, and I think if a bottom-up approach to an assembly line can have an impact, think of what kind of impact you can have in taking that kind of approach in a creative field like game development.
For me, it's also very important to build relationships and trust with all the people on the team so that they know that their opinions are being heard and that things are explained properly and that they feel supported and respected. I mean, I think it's kind of fundamental things, yeah.
I highly believe in the importance of playtests. And one thing that playtests show time and time again is that people enjoy your game a lot more if they understand the systems. It seems obvious, right? But the problem is we're always trying to jam-pack all of that knowledge into tutorials. And I think ideally, if you have excellent signs and feedback, you don't even necessarily need tutorials in your game. A company that consistently does this well is Nintendo games. I mean, you could see that they always have the visual cue and the animation and the sound effect and all of these things reinforcing each other to almost make it obvious what everything is going to do before you interact with it. If you look at, most games, it's crucially important that not only do you understand the objective and the consequences, but that you understand immediately what you can do to avoid further damage or avoid things. And I don't think you would ever design a game where you wait until the end of a level to find out what's been gaining you points or losing you points. And so it's surprising when a lot more is at stake. For example, in the workplace, when it's people's livelihood and security, that often the only time that people get feedback is once a year during the yearly evaluations.
These days, what you're seeing is that the importance of community is more important than ever. If you look at Star Citizen, for example, it's really more than just a game. It's a community where people, talk about their interest in space sims and, they're part of the development process and everyone who's contributed feels like they're part of something. And I think it's the same thing for League of Legends. It's the fact that I play this and I go watch the tournaments. I'm part of something else.
So Steam Workshop has done a great job of tapping into the community and peers in order to vote, what hats get into the game. And this is great on many different levels because it puts Valve out of the hot seat. They don't have to be the ones deciding exactly what gets to go in and what doesn't and be the bad guys who rule out your, unicorn hat or whatever it is that you've submitted. It also creates more engagement in the community because they own, what gets in and they own the game more themselves. Actually, the way MMOs typically do the distribution of loot for raids is also a peer-based system. And leaving that system up to the community means that they can decide on their own way that they want to manage things, and you can also decide which guild to join based on what rules they use for loot distribution. So it's actually a much better system. There are examples of how peer-based systems have been very successful in companies as well. An example I heard of is there is a company that really wanted to cut costs. One of the main areas where a lot of abuse was happening, where a lot of spending was happening, was in expense reports. What they could have done, and I guess the logical thing to do if that was the case, would be to change the expense policy and say, okay, right, only presidents can fly first class now. But what they decided to do instead was they just decided to publish the expense reports where everyone could see. And amazingly, the abuse stopped immediately. Actually, there became this competition between people in the office on who could be more frugal, who could save the most on their expense reports. And I think we're seeing a trend in the strength of peer-based systems across different industries. Like now, for example, instead of going to read a travel magazine to find out about a place you might want to visit, people are more interested in tapping their social networks and finding out where friends went and where they like to stay. The same is true in video games. So what we're seeing is people don't care as much about the score that they got or beating a game. They care more about doing the crazy thing in the game that they can post online and have something worthy of sharing. research has found that many rewards will actually reduce internal motivation over the long term. The one type of reward that actually amplifies internal motivation is peer recognition. In conclusion, the video game industry has changed quite a bit. What players are interested in is quite different than it was before. And those changes are actually reflected in changes in the workforce and how people want to be motivated and engaged at work as well. The old model for video games, or the more traditional one that we can think of, was that players were, you were kind of designing this rat maze for players, right? And their job was to get through one challenge after another, figure out what the game designer had in mind, and eventually get to the cheese. The new model is really that I'm going to play with the systems, I'm going to create my own fun, my own story, and I'm going to share that with people. Really, for companies to have a leading edge today, it's about harnessing that creative energy and the ideas of everyone on the team. It's not surprising that the games that are the most popular these days are the games that let people practice and express their creativity. And I think, we can trust Albert Einstein for saying some intelligent things, and he says that play is the highest form of research. And I think that does explain a shift in the kind of practice and things that people want to do in games. And so I'll leave you with this one question. What is the workplace equivalent of live streaming your Minecraft session? Thank you very much for your attention. You've been a really great audience.
Other game paradigms, like using repetitive mechanics in your gameplay, usually based on violence, is something that never worked again for storytelling.
So, I think, first of all, if you give somebody a mission, you say, okay, your mission is to go and rescue this person, already you create some drama there. However, if you take that a step further and say, give the person the power to decide how they get there, what time they arrive, what kind of path they use to sneak into the base, then it creates even more drama and gives them more freedom.